Informamos novamente que o evento será integralmente transmitido pelos canais do YouTube, do Arquivo Nacional, @Arquivo Nacional Brasil, e do Museu Histórico Nacional, Museu Histórico Nacional, _Rio, e que haverá tradução simultânea para os presentes no auditório do Arquivo Nacional. Quem ainda não pegou o seu aparelho para tradução simultânea, por favor, façam atrás no auditório. Retomamos a programação com a mesa Museus, Reparação e Escravidão, sob a moderação de Mônica Lima e Souza, professora da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro e diretora-geral do Arquivo Nacional. Mônica, quem convidamos para subir ao palco, também pesquisa a memória da escravidão e políticas de reparação histórica. Convidamos para compor a mesa Aline Montenegro, professora da Universidade de São Paulo e curadora do Museu Histórico Nacional, atua com cultura material afro-brasileira e museologia da diáspora africana, e apresentará a palestra Reflexões sobre cultura material da diáspora africana, o Museu Histórico Nacional, na exposição Para Além da Escravidão. Shanaz Garland, curadora do Museu Zico Slave Lodge, África do Sul. Trabalha com processos de cura e reconexão histórica em museus da escravidão. Sua fala terá como temática cura, conexão e recuperação no Museu Zico Slave Lodge. E Miles Greenwood, curador do Museu Internacional da Escravidão, Inglaterra. Atua em exposições sobre escravidão, abolição, e reparação no Reino Unido. O título de sua palestra é Curadoria sobre Escravidão, Abolição e Reparações na Grã-Bretanha. Passamos a palavra para a mediadora Mônica Lima, que conduzirá essa.
Olá, pessoas, boa tarde, muito boa tarde. Vamos dar início, então, a essa mesa, como foi identificada, né, sob o título geral de Museus, Reparação e Escravidão. Temos aqui 3 palestrantes que, com certeza, vão trazer muitas reflexões, muitas questões, para que pensemos sobre ela, para que possamos discutir, e ouvi-los nos trará, portanto, não apenas informações, mas perguntas, né? E estou reservando aqui, né, na minha programação mental, e espero conseguir fazer aqui, de fato, um tempo para comentários e perguntas logo após. Vou seguir a ordem das apresentações, a ordem que está, né, na programação do seminário, e faço apenas um pequeno reparo inicial, né, em que informo que Fatumata, a Câmara, que estaria nessa mesa, e Paul Gardulo não poderão estar por diferentes razões, né? Lamentamos as ausências, mas podemos dizer que serão, né, lembrados aqui como pensadores importantes para a temática da qual iremos tratar. Sem mais delongas, procedo ao início dessa mesa, trazendo a fala de Aline Montenegro. Aline, bacharel e licenciada em História pela UFRJ, mestre e doutor em História Social também pela UFRJ, é docente do Museu Paulista da USP, da Universidade de São Paulo, onde também atua como chefe de divisão de acervo e curadoria. A Aline trabalhou por mais de 20 anos como historiadora no Museu Histórico Nacional, ligada ao IBRAM, Instituto Brasileiro de Museus, cuja presidenta esteve aqui de manhã na mesa de abertura. Tendo assumido o cargo nesse museu de diretora substituta entre fevereiro e julho de 2022. Aline Montenegro foi bolsista pós-doutorado sênior do CNPq entre 2018 e 2020, desenvolvendo o projeto de pesquisa Os Negros no Museu Histórico Nacional, por uma coleção descolonizada 1922-2018. Aline Montenegro integra o Conselho Editorial da Revista do Instituto do Patrimônio Histórico e Artístico Nacional, o IFAM, o Conselho de Orientação Artística da Pinacoteca de São Paulo e o Comitê Curatorial dos Museus Casa das Rosas, Casa Guilherme de Almeida e Casa Mário de Andrade. Tem experiência na área de História, com ênfase em escrita da história dos museus e no patrimônio, atuando principalmente nos seguintes temas: colecionismo e cultura material da diáspora africana em museus. Aline, a palavra é sua. Alerto a todos os integrantes da mesa, perdão, Aline, né? Eu peço que as falas tenham de 15 a 20 minutos, né? Para que a gente possa ter esse tempo de debate. Muito obrigada.
Alô? Bom, boa tarde para todo mundo. Obrigada pela presença. Boa tarde ao pessoal que está nos assistindo pelo YouTube. Boa tarde, bom dia, boa noite, porque a gente não sabe, né, a que horas essa sessão será vista na internet. E por causa disso, eu vou começar me audiodescrevendo. Eu sou uma mulher negra, tenho cabelos curtos com corte assimétrico, crespos. Estou com óculos de aro branco, óculos de grau de aro branco, visto uma blusa com um decote em V na cor preta e uso um colar com um búzio solitário. Na mão esquerda, uma aliança quadrada e um relógio de pulseira azul, e na mão direita, um anel de aço com os detalhes coloridos, os círculos coloridos. Bom, então eu gostaria de começar parabenizando a organização desse seminário, agradecendo a Keila, a Marta, a Laís, a Mônica, não só por proporcionar esse momento de discussão, de reflexão, mas por liderar, né, a montagem de toda uma programação que envolve a inauguração da exposição Para Além da Escravidão, construindo a liberdade negra no mundo. Quero também parabenizar a equipe do Museu Histórico Nacional, né, na figura do André, do Cristiano, que estão mantendo essa tradição também do Museu Histórico Nacional ter um seminário anual, né, já foi virtual durante o período da pandemia, e a gente segue com esse marco também no calendário, né? Agradecer também a Patrícia Mafra, ao Pedro Hering, que agora está no Arquivo Nacional, mas que dirigiu o Museu Histórico Nacional, está aí fazendo, né, Pedro? E, enfim, né, agradecer também a Laís Rocha por todo esse trabalho, toda a atenção, todo o cuidado com todos nós, viu, Laís? Seu trabalho foi fundamental. Para não gastar muito do tempo de vocês, eu preparei um textinho que, na verdade, ele foi publicado no blog Exposições. Esse blog é um projeto de extensão que é coordenado por mim e pela professora Karina Martins, da UERJ, do Departamento de Arquitetura da UERJ, e ele é um espaço onde a gente compartilha uma série de artigos, ideias que têm relação com esse nosso trabalho no universo dos museus, do patrimônio, das memórias. E eu preparei esse texto, na verdade, esse texto é nosso, né? Meu, da professora Keila e da professora Marta. Quer dizer, eu preparei a minha fala com base nesse texto, porque esse texto ele foi uma versão escrita de uma live que nós fizemos há 2 semanas atrás, falando sobre o papel educativo da exposição, que foi inaugurada ontem, que foi aberta ao público hoje, e que contou também com a participação do Edmilson Santos e da Moana Soto. Então, eu vou ler esse artigo. A exposição, talvez eu me repita um pouco em relação ao que já foi dito aqui, né? Mas a exposição para além da escravidão, construindo a liberdade negra no mundo, é a edição brasileira da exposição itinerante In Slavery's Wake, Making Black Freedom in the World, inaugurada em dezembro do ano passado e encerrada em junho deste ano, no Museu Nacional de História e Cultura Afro-Americana do Instituto Smithsonian, em Washington, D.C. A exposição aborda como a escravidão e as práticas de resistência e conquista de liberdade moldaram o mundo contemporâneo marcado pelo racismo. Ela estabelece uma conexão entre a história global construída pelo tráfico transatlântico de escravizados e as especificidades locais da escravidão e do pós-abolição. É fruto de uma curadoria internacional coordenada pelos professores Paul Gardulo, que deveria, né, estar aqui, lamentamos muito a impossibilidade dele estar com a gente, e o Tony Boggs, que falou mais cedo, da Universidade de Brown. E envolveu pesquisadores de 6 países, né? Aqui eu quero chamar a atenção para o trabalho da Giovanna Obenda, que coordenou, né, essa orquestra de várias vozes, de várias línguas, nesse projeto, junto com o Paul, junto com a Dolly Butter. Então, quero parabenizá-la e agradecer também, Giovanna, por todo o cuidado, por toda a competência, por toda a excelência do seu trabalho nessa liderança. Uma mulher negra maravilhosa aí, que também assina o livro da exposição junto com o Tony Boggs e com o Paul Gardulo. Parabéns. Também tiveram pesquisadores, né, da África do Sul, com a Shanaz Galante aqui, e com o Paul Jackman, do Senegal, o Ibrahim Anchal. Algumas pessoas vocês viram, né, no filme das Conversas Inacabadas, e da Fotomata, que também não pôde estar aqui, Fotomata Câmara. Da Bélgica, nós contamos com a Bambi Coppens, e do Reino Unido com o Miles Greenwood. E essa exposição, saindo aqui do Rio de Janeiro, o ano que vem, ela vai itinerar, né, por museus na África do Sul, no Senegal e em Liverpool, lugares também que foram abordados aqui mais cedo. Eu e Keila somos as curadoras que representamos o Brasil nesse projeto curatorial global, que envolve também outros pesquisadores brasileiros, como a Marta Abreu e o Vinícius Natal. No trabalho, nós nos baseamos, né, como também já foi dito aqui, no trabalho já realizado em nível nacional, com destaque para o projeto Passados Presentes, bem como o que vinha sendo desenvolvido também no Museu Histórico Nacional, em termos de pesquisa sobre a cultura material afrodiaspórica. Nós, além de contribuirmos para a construção do conceitual da exposição junto com os colegas, né, num trabalho intenso, né, de muitas reuniões, atravessando a pandemia, né, muitos encontros, nós também selecionamos histórias e objetos para compor essa exposição. Então, eu queria passar a primeira imagem, que foi, eu espero que a gente possa colecionar, Keila, as fotos das inaugurações. Essa foi a primeira. Essa foi a primeira, e que a gente tenha outras tantas dessa inauguração. Então, a exposição, ela tem 6 módulos, né, que, didaticamente falando, podem ser entendidos em 3 partes. A primeira trata do processo histórico de construção da escravidão entre finais do século XV até o século XIX, com as abolições. A segunda é sobre as experiências de liberdade e combate à escravidão, em suas diferentes formas, como as lutas judiciais, rebeliões, festas e práticas religiosas. E a última é sobre o tempo presente e os rastros da escravidão impactando a vida das pessoas, como justiça social, questões ambientais que afetam as populações de maneiras diferentes e, o mais importante, a discussão sobre reparação histórica. Painéis interativos, mapas variados, recursos museográficos e intervenções artísticas, principalmente para representar objetos ausentes, fazem da exposição um espaço didático para se navegar. Entre muitos conteúdos, o circuito nos permite sentir e pensar, nos provocando a posicionamentos e transformações, principalmente com todas as questões, todas as perguntas que atravessam todo o circuito. Nessa proposta, nossa proposta aqui, nossa, meu texto deu um salto. Nossa proposta aqui é navegar por essa esteira da escravidão, que é a tradução literal do nome original da exposição, enfatizando a participação do Brasil na sua composição. Sua primeira parte consiste numa introdução sobre os rastros da escravidão, mas rastro aqui é entendido como um termo marítimo que dá nome àquela marca espumada que as embarcações deixam nas águas do mar por onde passam, no sentido entendido por Cristina Sharp em seu livro No Vestígio, Negridade e Existência. Não por acaso, o primeiro vídeo que se vê ao entrar na exposição é o que projeta cenas de etapas de campo de pesquisas arqueológicas em sítios de naufrágio de embarcações escravagistas nos mares do Brasil, de Moçambique e de Senegal, realizadas pelo projeto Slaves Reps, que amanhã talvez o Felipe, que está aqui, para explicar melhor, né? Já o segundo vídeo, que também está no início da exposição, contrapõe imagens do passado escravagista com as das comunidades negras contemporâneas do mundo. Agora eu lembrei que eu tenho um controle e que eu consigo passar. E aí um detalhe, né, dessa parte introdutória. Na sequência, essa obra é de 1992, chama-se Filhos de Iemanjá, só que no blog tem a legenda mais completa. Na sequência, nós adentramos as raízes das desigualdades, com objetos, documentos, imagens e depoimentos sobre a construção da escravidão racial e seus instrumentos de legitimação, em um processo de colonização marcado pela violência, desumanização e morte de pessoas. O foco está na legislação, no regime econômico e nos argumentos científicos, religiosos e políticos dos séculos XV e XIX para justificar e sustentar essa escravidão. Nesse núcleo, que é o mais estreito e escuro, destacamos a presença de 2 objetos sensíveis das coleções museológicas brasileiras. Uma balança de ferro, do Museu de Artes e Ofícios de Belo Horizonte, oriunda da Bahia e com a data de 1767 gravada em seu travessão. Supostamente, era usada para pesar os corpos de pessoas negras como parte da atribuição de valor monetário para a venda. Aí também se encontra a máscara de Flandres do acervo do Museu Histórico Nacional. O módulo para Além da Escravidão é dedicado às experiências de africanos e afrodescendentes como agentes de ideais e lutas pela liberdade. O intuito é mostrar que sempre houve resistência e experiências de emancipação que tensionaram o regime escravista. Esse conceito interfere, inclusive, na circulação dos visitantes, que, a partir daí, torna-se mais livre, fluida e com maior luminosidade. Duas personalidades da nossa história são representadas: Francisco José do Nascimento, mais conhecido como o Dragão do Mar, e a que ficou conhecida como Escrava Anastácia, ambos tornados heróis e referenciados até os dias de hoje. O primeiro foi um jangadeiro cearense, negro, abolicionista, que se recusou a transportar pessoas escravizadas da costa de Fortaleza para os navios fundeados que as transportariam para a venda no Rio de Janeiro, em 1881. Liderou uma greve de jangadeiros num ato de liberdade que contribuiu, que forçou a abolição da escravidão no Ceará em 1884, 4 anos antes da abolição no país. Já Anastácia tem sua representação mostrada pelas lentes da apropriação política e religiosa de sua memória pelos movimentos negros, pela Umbanda, onde integra falantes de pretos e pretas velhas, e pelo afrocatolicismo, com culto à sua santidade por parte das Irmandades Negras de Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Pretos, e não pela Igreja Católica, que ainda não a reconheceu. E esse culto é especialmente na Irmandade de Salvador e da cidade do Rio de Janeiro. E é nessa parte que está a arte contemporânea de Yuri Cruz, Monumento à Voz da Anastácia, como um ato de reparação, libertando-a dos grilhões da escravidão e devolvendo boca e voz a essa escravizada, para que nenhuma mulher negra seja mais privada do seu direito de fala, da sua liberdade. Então, aí, o núcleo da... obrigada. Falando do Dragão do Mar, e aí a parte da Anastácia. Aliás, a arte contemporânea compõe toda a narrativa histórica da exposição num diálogo de temporalidade que questiona e induz a pensar sobre como lidar com esse passado difícil da escravidão ainda tão presente no nosso mundo contemporâneo. É a permanência do racismo que marginaliza, criminaliza e mata pessoas negras até hoje. Vide a tragédia que se abateu no Rio de Janeiro, aqui, há 2 semanas, cujas balas do governador tinham uma pele alva, a negra. Vale destacar, entre 6 e 7 que foram produzidas, especialmente para a exposição, a bandeira idealizada da Revolta dos Alfaiates, que aconteceu na Bahia em 1798. Essa bandeira foi produzida por Vivian Smith e é composta por cores e símbolos que representam a apropriação contemporânea potente do evento histórico por parte do autor, que criou esse objeto ano passado, em 2024. Então, essa é a parte, ali tem uma parte das bandeiras, e aqui um detalhe para a bandeira, da conjuração baiana. Mas arte contemporânea, então, assim, essa linguagem, essa criação desses objetos também vem muito no sentido de ocupar um espaço onde não há materialidade histórica, né? Então, é a arte contemporânea dialogando com a história e trazendo imagens de fatos históricos. Mas a arte contemporânea se faz ainda mais presente na quarta seção da exposição, Universo da Criação e da Liberdade. Uma grande parede ondulada e azul da cor do mar cria um espaço reservado para a meditação sobre as experiências da escravidão e liberdade. Uma pausa para sentir e descansar, onde uma animação representa práticas culturais afrodiaspóricas, como o toque dos tambores, nos envolvendo e enredando nessa obra realizada pelo artista Daniel Minter. E recheando essa parede, objetos artísticos e rituais que foram fundamentais nas formas de reexistência negra diante da violência da escravidão e resistiram, dando sentido e fortalecendo as existências negras no mundo contemporâneo. Do Brasil, o Abebé de Oxum, do Museu Histórico Nacional, compõe o conjunto de objetos dessa parede, objetos de ferro. Então, aqui o Abebé de Oxum, e aqui a parede onde se vê o Abebé, ali em cima, junto com outros objetos de outros lugares, mas dando esse sentido para as existências afrodiaspóricas. A penúltima parte da exposição, Velhas Práticas em uma Nova Era, é voltada para a reflexão sobre como os sistemas de violência e opressão do tempo da escravidão são atualizados e insistem em estruturar as relações sociais, políticas, econômicas e culturais segundo o racismo. São os passados presentes e as diversas formas de enfrentá-lo. Do acervo do Museu de História e Cultura Afro-Americana, uma algema do século XIX e outra da atualidade, ambas fabricadas pela Haight & Company, da Inglaterra, atestam a perenidade da indústria da violência. Uma indesejável permanência, a exemplo do apartheid da África do Sul, que foi uma experiência pós-abolição, mas que manteve essa raiz da escravidão, do preconceito, e assassinatos como da nossa criadora Marielle Franco, mulher preta, bissexual e periférica, a segunda mais votada naquela eleição. A última parte, Construindo Futuros, dedica-se a escutar as vozes das pessoas que vivem na esteira da escravidão, ou seja, que convivem com os desafios que envolvem ser preto e colonizado no mundo contemporâneo. Apesar de entrelaçar todo o circuito expositivo, as falas ganham mais espaço e profundidade aqui. Trata-se do projeto Conversas Inacabadas, que foi apresentado aqui mais cedo e que no Brasil teve a liderança da Marta Abreu e do Vinícius Natal. Então, aqui fica mais evidente o trabalho coletivo envolvendo as comunidades afrodiaspóricas dos países participantes num cruzo entre vivências transoceânicas e cotidianos locais. Pode passar? Aí a professora Mônica Lima, dando depoimento, já estou terminando já. Então, nesse projeto de edificação de um futuro mais justo, estão em jogo percorrer caminhos de cura e reparação. É aqui que são expostos os artefatos arqueológicos do Cais do Valongo, que também foi falado aqui como patrimônio da humanidade, e são artefatos que pela primeira vez encontrarão o continente africano de onde partiram há centenas de anos. Aí a vitrine que ele se encontra. Então, enfim, esperamos que todos possam ter nessa exposição um lugar de aprendizado, de reflexão e de inspiração para lutas contra o racismo e por reparação histórica no mundo. Muito obrigada.
Nós que te agradecemos, Aline, muito obrigada também. Obrigada.
Pode. Eu queria só compartilhar o link das provisões, onde tem esse texto. Também tem um outro texto que eu escrevi com Yuri Cruz sobre o monumento à voz de Anastácia. Então, visitem-nos também.
Bom, gente, eu acho que essa apresentação da Aline já nos fez ter mais vontade ainda nos fez ter mais vontade ainda de ver a exposição. E agora ver a exposição a partir das questões que ela trouxe aqui, ou seja, quem já viu, ver de novo, e quem ainda não viu, vivamente lhes aconselho a que visitem a exposição no Museu Histórico Nacional, que a partir de hoje está aberta ao público. Sem mais, vou passar a palavra à segunda integrante, né, dessa mesa, Chanaz Além, que é curadora do Museu Isico Bocat e apresenta passeios e programas de divulgação no museu e no Isico Slave Lodge. Ela também está envolvida na pesquisa sobre exposições e publicações com foco no patrimônio imaterial. Sua missão é transformar os espaços dos museus e torná-los mais inclusivos, acessíveis e emocionantes. Obrigada, Chanaz. Bem-vinda.
Everybody hear me? So I'll be talking about the work that we're doing at the Slave Lodge, that we've been doing for the past 3 years at the Isico Slave Lodge Museum in Cape Town. In the end, it's about healing, connecting, and recovering our history. And the history of slavery is a difficult and traumatic history. So when we approach it, when we think about it, when we research that history, it's always with a marked sensitivity. It's crucial that we think that way, and that we think about it, and focus on it. Not so good. So I just like to start because we've got a Brazilian audience, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much you know about South African history, slave history in particular. And so I've used this map, and we have this map in the Slave Lodge Museum in Cape Town to show the route along the Indian Ocean. So Cape Town essentially was part of the Indian Ocean slave trade, and the enslaved people were brought. It started in 1658 until 1858, when we were emancipated, 1 December 1858. But the map is just to show you the route along the Indian Ocean from where our people were brought. And we find it's very important to break it down so that people understand where the enslaved were brought from. So we say about 51% were brought from Africa. And we talk East Africa, in particular, Madagascar. Many enslaved people brought from Madagascar, also East Mozambican origin. And then, of course, it's also enslaved people brought from Asia. So India, Southeast Asia, and only 1% from Malaysia. And it's important to also to say that it was under Dutch law that the slave lodge was built in 1679. So we're using the exact same building in which over 9,000 people were kept at the slave lodge, company-owned slaves, men, women, and children. Okay, and then just to give you a sense of how we thought, and it was very difficult we realized once we got the space on the ground floor of the slave lodge, and we got the budget to start narrating and exhibiting our history of slavery according to ourselves and in our own interpretation. It was a very big story to put into quite a small space. So what we've used is interpreted history as a method to convey the narrative of slavery. And as we were going along, we realized it's not just the 9,000 people in the slave lodge whose stories we have to tell. It's not just the over 63,000 enslaved people brought to the Cape. but it's also the stories of the descendants being told. All our stories have to be told in that small space, in a sense. So where we started was in the problem. We basically located ourselves in the problem, and the problem was that until that point, until our very first democratic election, the history of slavery was not included in our school curriculum. It was not part of a general knowledge or understanding of basic history of the people of South Africa. The history was erased in a sense. So, but not all of us didn't know about it. Many families do understand that they would understand their heritage. Through oral tradition, people knew from their parents, etc., that we were descendants of slaves. So it was very important then for us to get them to tell the story, I mean, to include that as we went along. So what I'll do for the rest of the presentation, is to just show you the different rooms and to explain to you what it is that we've done. So it's very important, I should say, that because a lot of people in South Africa, especially Black people and descendants, didn't understand or know the history of slavery and how they were connected to it, it was important for us, using an interpretive method, to reclaim a inclusive space, because that's what the slave lodge was up until a certain point. The very history of the enslaved that was kept in the slave lodge wasn't part of the museum's narrative. So it's only in the late 90s, and in 2005 they only launched the first exhibition on slavery. But then again, what we've done in the last 3 years was we've reclaimed the space in the name of our ancestors. So our ancestors being the enslaved, the indigenous, and the free Blacks. And then just a very brief definition of free Blacks. Free Blacks were people, some free Blacks were brought by the Dutch, were people that were not enslaved, very small percentage. And then all the free Blacks were able then to manipulate by enslaved people out of slavery. And that's how the free Black community grew at the time. So, and if you look at the slide, that is what we mean. That is so when we started the space, the new spaces. This we call it the Lena van der Kaap group. And Lena van der Kaap was an enslaved woman that was born in the slave lodge, and she managed to escape the slave lodge. But sadly, she was recaptured. However, the recapturing led to traces being left in the archive. Her testament, she was basically interrogated, and traces of her story and the history of how she managed to escape and where she ended up and how she was, recaptured. We've got that in the archive, and we just thought, in terms of reclaiming space, the first room should be named for a enslaved woman. And so that's Nina's room. And when we did that, as we took the historic ground floor plan that shows you the historic spaces in the slave lodge, we then decided to do a contemporary overlay. And that's the black section that you see on top. So it looks like it's floating. So when you enter the room, that is what draws you. And then we explain, like how we reclaim the space in their names. And their names is really important. And it's about humanizing the enslaved. We thought it was really important to sort of move beyond the image of the time of slave, right? We do tell the truth, the ugly truth about slavery in the back passages along the back of the slave lodge where we started initially. So we talk about labor, we talk about punishment, we talk about all those kinds of things. But these spaces was meant to call it the contemporary history of the slave lodge, and it's meant to bring you into the present. And then one of the questions that we were always asked the educators and myself, when we would take people through the slave lodge, when they were looking at the older and the first tranche of exhibitions from 2005, it was always, who were the slaves? Where are the slaves? Where's their stories? And so it's also important that I say that we have many public engagements, and over the years, many public engagements, public programming, where we brought people in, descendant community people in, and we had discussions about what it is that, you know, we needed to do in terms of history, the need for history, identity, and just broadening the knowledge on slave history that would help our people. So in this room, and this is in Lena's room, we frame it within the question, who were the enslaved? And then we proceed to tell the stories of three. We identified three of them who all lived to see emancipation, hence the stronger sort of archival traces, and because it's later, the slaves that managed past 1858. So we've got Katie Jacobs and a few others, Lydia, Katie, and the man that actually sold sweets and donuts on the square right by the place where the slave lodge was, where slaves were sold. And then this is the next room, it's the Jan Smithson room. And in the Jan Smithson room, Jan Smithson was born in the slave lodge. He later becomes a teacher and like a headmaster of the slave lodge. And what was really important was that he wasn't just a teacher, he was also a healer. Because what was found in about 1960 in our National Archive was Jan Smithson's notebook. His notebook that had lesson plans and lots of lesson plans, arithmetic, religious instruction, hymns, that kind of thing was in it. But what struck people who would actually research and people going through the material was that he had homeopathic remedies in the book written in Tamil. And the homeopathic remedies, we can only, our interpretation of it is that he used it to heal the enslaved. And the type of remedies in his book was remedies for backache, remedies for toothache. And then also there was a remedy for venereal disease. And we tell that story about how enslaved women were terribly abused in the slave lodge by settlers and free men that would come into the slave lodge each night and abuse these women. And so we had a serious problem. And what we've done is we reclaimed the space in his name, but it was actually the hospital of the lodge, the original hospital. And according to archival evidence, the patients, the majority of the patients in the hospital were enslaved women and indigenous women who were being treated for venereal disease. And so that gives you a very strong idea of what was going on in school. And so, but it was important for us to show that humanity again, that Jan Smithson was a slave, but he was also a teacher and he was also a leader. And if you think about being enslaved and the 12-hour and 15-hour days that they were forced into some of the most horrendous labor, you can just imagine the kind of ailments and pain that they had. But it's also important to know that they themselves were agents of healing for themselves, and he was able to provide that. And he's one that we know about, that's more prominent, but we'd like to believe that there was more. And then, then we've got, and it was very important for us, so not just the names, but then we used the Ezekiel archive, the William Peer archive, we used that in order to show, we played with scale, because a lot of the historical paintings, and yes, it's colonial paintings, and it's very important, it's important to state it, but it's also important for us to say that it is our interpretation now of colonial paintings. So how we see it and how we display it is very different to how the older museum professionals at the Ezekiel Museum sort of showed it. And what we found in a lot of the paintings, the enslaved were faces, they were small, you just see the hat. The hat was symbolic of it. And it also noticed that they were enslaved in the paintings by the fact that they walked barefoot. They weren't allowed to have shoes. So we tried to play with scale, and we tried to make the paintings bigger. And we tried to focus on the enslaved. Washerwomen, for example, was one of the first jobs, massive jobs that was done by enslaved women. And then later, and when I say jobs in terms of payment, was later done by free black women. Great demand to have the clothes cleaned. And so in Cape Town, they would walk up the mountain, and there would be swings on the mountain, and they would wash the clothes, the old weight beads on the rocks, dry it, put it on their heads, and then walk down. And that is what you see in that image, that painting. The woman is walking down. And it was a very iconic, it's a very iconic image, and it was a very common image at the time. And that was the first career, so to speak, that where free black women were able to feed themselves and their children. So we thought it was very important to show that. Also, the lady on the left, I think it is, yeah. Anyway, but the lady on the left, that's a free black woman. Her name is Nasia. She was the first free black woman that was. Yeah. Okay. No, not. So she was the first image, painting of a free black woman that we have, and she was an actual person. She lived in what is now known as the workout, and she was married. Her husband's name was Karl Pilgrim. He was actually the first Muslim that went on pilgrimage ever at the Cape. So they were actually a very prominent couple, and it's the only known visual depiction of her and of a free black person. Okay, yeah. I mean, this is just to show the way the whole gallery came into being was the Bell. I don't know if you know about the Lakes Museum, but they had a slavery exhibition. I think it could be like about 6 years ago, the last one that they had, and they had loaned the Bell from Zika. And that's an actual slave vowel from Oranje, which is as you go up the mountain, it's a very hustling urban settlement, like town, further up, very affluent space, and that was actually owned by the Van Breda family, slave-owned holding family, which is now in the city of Cape Town, one of the market farms. And that was the bell that called the slaves to work, regulated the days, the hours, the minutes. That was the bell. And that's why that whole room, the young speaker room, is about labor. It's about what it is that they did. And it was about how they built Cape Town. And it's really important again for us to reclaim their agency in that way. Okay. And then the last two spaces that we did, okay. So the last two spaces that we did, we just opened it now in July. It's a contemporary history wing. It's the Hermanus Matroos room. And Hermanus Matroos' story is also very interesting. His mother was a slave, his father was, of course, a speaking person from the Eastern Cape. And he ended up fighting the frontier wars, and it was just it was important for us. Paul Teachman, my colleague Paul Teachman, that just with the documentary, he did the research in this room, and he wrote the text on the Hermanus Matroos. And it's very important for us to show that the enslaved at the Cape were not confined to the Cape. They did not only build the Cape, they did not only contribute to the Cape, they contributed nationwide. And that was the way, and he's a prime example to show how they moved agency, resistance, how they resisted colonial rule. Right? And then also, it is also very important for us at the Slave Lodge with the timeline. So we have a timeline, very much a televised timeline, to show that slavery is connected to the history of South Africa. And that is very important. And also the sad thing is that it has been terribly overlooked. And we can't continue to ignore our people's history. And so that is why we've done it that way. And then also what we've done, we put contemporary history in. we've got the photographs of Cedric Nunn, a very popular and well-loved photographer in South Africa. He was part also like of the anti-apartheid movement, taking photographs during that time. But his work was not just centered on that. His work was also about spaces, environmental shots, and that is all the Eastern Cape, in and around the Eastern Cape, and it's all spaces of conflict. All spaces of conflict with the Xhosa for the British, and so that is what we have, and it's meant to just play on the whole notion of space and how our history is connected in South Africa. And it's a very last room because it makes freedom from history of slavery to a people's history. So in terms of humanizing the enslaved, this is what it's about for us. And it's about acknowledging and celebrating how they fought. Because often, like I say, our history has been ignored, but celebrating who they are. And so we've got a 12-meter painting in the space, in the gallery, and that's of Geland van der Kaap, a rural slave. And so we're tying it to, like what you see unfinished conversations in the big documentary, where you see we have spoken to farm workers who are descendants of the rural slaves. So we managed to tie that to an 1825 rebellion led by a young rural slave by the name of Geland van der Kaap. In the Kowa itself, which is part of rural, it's not in the city. It's like about maybe 3 hours away, just under 3 hours away from Cape Town. And he led a group of enslaved and Khoi indigenous people against a very cruel slaveholder. And he actually ended up killing the slaveholder and seriously injuring another farm owner and slaveholder. And it sent shockwaves through the colony. He was caught, and he was executed. But if you read the court records and the newspaper articles of the time, they were very scared of what he represented. And 1825 was just a few years before emancipation. But he grew tired of the fact that Britain had now made slavery illegal or banned the slave trade. But I mean, of course, we know that slavery continued in the colonies, and he was tired of it. And that's what he did. He led the rebellion, and sadly, he was caught. And we didn't have there was no image of him. And so it was very important for us to speak to the artist and ask her to show his face, to show her face. And so it's very powerful. It's the first time we had a visual depiction. And so, but so that is very important for us, and it gets people very emotional because it's the first time we have that. And then I think this is the last slide. It's just to show you what we've done. It's going. I don't know why. But so we've got a film where we basically use descendants and ask them to just in their name, in our name, to reclaim the space. And so we've got descendants just saying their name and their surname, and very happy to do that. And so we've just got their names and their voices reverberating through the space. And so to create that atmosphere of inclusion and acknowledgement of it. And then just lastly to say, we have 2 cases as well that contains the stories of, I'm not sure if you know her, Halsey September, who was an anti-apartheid activist who was murdered in Paris. And she was part of the top structure of the ANC in exile, and she was shot in Paris. And she, through her name, we know without doubt, September is a slave name. Months of the year, those slave names are very, very most common. And so we thought again as a way of connecting slavery to her story, incredible story, her resistance, and sadly, the way she ended, we thought it was very important to have a presence in that space as it's connected. And so we actually got a travel bag in the space. In the case, we got letters from her nephew, as well as a travel bag. And so we were able to lift her voice in a sense, and we were able to put those quotes on her case. And then lastly, we've got Dr. William Pick. In the other case, Dr. William Pick is a medical doctor who studied at the University of Cape Town. And the way we connected with him was that he was looking into doing more research on these slave ancestry, which he knew about it. And he wrote a book. He wrote his own book called The Slave Has Overcome, where he talks about in detail about his slave ancestry as much as he knew. And he also spoke about how very difficult it was for him as a young colored 16-year-old studying medicine at UCT that was very racist at the time that he was studying. And so that struggle he speaks about as well as the struggle as a medical doctor working in the public health sector, all the way through to democracy. And in a way, we feel, like with the broad arch, we connect him to our system as well, healing, teaching, and Dr. Pick was a teacher. Right? So classes at UCT, etc., and books. So it just was very important for us to include these people and these stories, and for our people to see visitors coming in, that line, and who they are, and that's really important. And thank you.
Thank you, Shanaz Galan. Thank you so much. Muito obrigada, Shanaz Galan. Enfim, importantíssimas informações e reflexões, né? Como nossos espaços museais, nossos lugares de memória atravessados por dores, né? Atravessados pela dor, podem ser também locais de reconhecimento e de afirmação. Então, seguindo com essa mesa, vou passar a palavra agora para Myers Greenwood. Myers Greenwood, ele é curador, líder, né, do tema Escravidão Atlântica e Legados no Museu Internacional da Escravidão, que faz parte dos Museus Nacionais de Liverpool. Ele se concentra em abordar os legados da escravidão e do Império por meio de exposições, pesquisas e envolvimento da comunidade, e já trabalhou anteriormente para a Glasgow Live. O trabalho de Greenwood envolve destacar o impacto histórico da escravidão e seus efeitos contínuos na sociedade contemporânea, incluindo a curadoria de itens desafiadores como objetos racistas. Myers Greenwood, a palavra é sua.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just to start by giving myself a very quick visual description. I am a man with brown skin, bald hair, and metal-rimmed glasses as well, and a bit of stubble on my chin. Today, I am going to focus more so on the material and visual culture that we have in the care of the International Slavery Museum. I'm really trying to give a bit of context as to how slavery sits within the conscious and memory of the British public, to hopefully give people a sense as to how this might sit in relation to how slavery is understood here. But beforehand, I'm just going to point out that this picture is where the International Slavery Museum is based. It's on the waterfront in Liverpool, beside a dockyard, which is a site with multiple heritage spaces, but it is a site that is intimately associated with transatlantic slavery, as I will come to. And it's therefore an appropriate site for Liverpool to host the only national museum in the UK dedicated to transatlantic slavery. So to give a little bit of further context to the museum that I work at, the International The International Slavery Museum is one of 7 museums managed by National Museums Liverpool in the United Kingdom. The development of the museum itself has a long, complicated, and very interesting history that I will refrain from going into because I know that I only have 15 minutes. But its first tangible manifestation was in the form of an initially temporary exhibition on transatlantic slavery and its legacies, which opened in the basement of the Maritime Museum in 1994. And this is the same building that we're in now. In the lead up to the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, it was decided that the creation of the International Slavery Museum would be an integral part of widespread national initiatives to commemorate the British abolition of the slave trade. No, this is not the abolition of slavery, this is the abolition of the slave trade that took place in 1807. Therefore, the International Slavery Museum is part of a well-established tradition in Britain where public memory tends to focus on Britain's role in abolition rather than its complicity in slavery. Even though the International Slavery Museum itself primarily focuses on racial slavery and its legacies, with British abolition being more marginal to the overall narrative of the museum, by intentionally opening in 2007, it has become part of this tradition of commemorating abolition. I should also add to the context as well that the museum is currently closed until at least 2028. So by the end of this presentation, you really want to come and visit this museum for the first time, just to say, hold on for a little while, because we are going through a major redevelopment where we are rethinking all its displays and how we are presenting the narrative of slavery and its legacies. As a museum, we display and care for a range of material culture that speaks to the histories and legacies of racial slavery. What has been left to us from the past can reveal something of British perceptions and memories of its role in racial slavery. For example, this painting here on the left is a depiction of an unnamed slaving ship set off the African coast, painted by a Liverpool artist, William Jackson, in the 1700s, at the height of Liverpool's involvement in transatlantic slavery. Maritime paintings were popular in the 1700s and 1800s in Britain, but it's not always easy to actually tell whether they depict slaving ships. What enables us to identify this particular ship as a slaving ship are the breathing holes below deck where enslaved people would be held. However, the painting obscures much of the violent realities of slavery. There is no barricade, which is a device that would have been erected when slaving ships arrived on the coast of Atlantic Africa to separate the crew from the enslaved men in case of an insurrection. There are no families being torn apart, no enslaved people being forced to exercise above deck or thrown overboard to lighten the load of the ship. The image could be a generic merchant vessel, and these types of images were commonplace. They were etched onto the sides of bowls and cups, such as the one on the right-hand side here at the top, which wish success to their voyages that would lead to so much suffering and death. These are images and items of extreme violence, and yet they are quite mundane, which in turn adds to their violence. There might be many reasons for this avoidance of the very real realities of violence. For example, one might be that William Jackson, the painter who I mentioned, never actually saw a slaving ship off the African Atlantic coast. Or he never saw a slaving ship set on, in the docks of a Caribbean port. he saw slaving ships in the docks in Liverpool being loaded with textiles, glass beads, copper rods that would sail off to be traded for enslaved people by a crew of predominantly white sailors and merchants. And he saw them return with commodities produced by enslaved people, such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco, commodities that would enrich and develop Liverpool and cities around the United Kingdom. The artist was not exposed firsthand to the violence of people being loaded onto slaving ships, tortured, or worked to death on plantations. All of that happened beyond the horizon of the British coast. And I would argue that this distance is a reflection of how Britain perceived its role in slavery and has created the conditions by which British people have been able to misremember their involvement in slavery. There were, of course, some enslaved and formerly enslaved people who lived in Britain. Some of them were prominent abolitionists, as highlighted in the In Slavery's Wake exhibition. But unlike the United States, or indeed here in Brazil, they were not a significant part of the population, because Britain operated the practical functions of enslavement largely from afar. But it's absolutely integral to understand that Britain was absolutely central to the global operations of slavery. And this isn't at all to say that the British public did not know or to try and attempt to make excuses for William Jackson or any other painters who depicted sort of romanticized visions of slaving ships. They certainly were conscious of this. Particularly from the late 18th century, the abolitionist movement was one of the most popular mass political movements in the country. Images such as the more common one that shows the diagram of the front here shows the bodies of enslaved people lying in the hold of a ship. These kinds of images became effective tools of propaganda for abolitionists. They were accompanied by campaigns to boycott enslaved-grown products, to sign petitions for Parliament, and to down tools in solidarity. But this movement and the material cultures they left behind have also contributed to a misremembering of Britain's involvement in slavery by creating a disproportionate material memory of abolition. Another popular visual culture that arose out of Britain's abolition movement is the "Am not I a man and a brother" image that you can see here. This painting is in our collection, is by an unknown artist. It's one of the earliest known depictions of the "Am not I a man and a brother" image, but it was more widely popularized by Wedgwood medallions and pendants such as the one that you can see here. And these types of material culture received a very wide distribution, particularly amongst white abolitionists. Typically, they show an enslaved man, sometimes a woman, kneeling with their hands clasped together as though in prayer, looking to the sky and begging for pity. It was an idea perhaps more palatable to the British public than the reality of enslaved people actively and persistently resisting their enslavement, even through means of violence, such as in the case of the Haitian Revolution and the Baptist War in Jamaica. Or even perhaps more appealing than formerly enslaved people advocating for abolition on their own terms, such as Allen Piano, Mary Prince, and Ottobah Cugoano. Images such as this allowed white people in Britain to feel that they still maintain power over the freedom of enslaved people. And this shapes the contemporary material record today. There are far more Wedgwood medallions in museum collections and items that celebrate the ending of slavery than there are tangible items that speak to how enslaved people understood and sought freedom on their own terms. If, as a museum, we rely on material culture to tell our stories, how does a curator put into perspective the comparative significance of a well-meaning petition to end slavery in Britain in comparison to the Haitian Revolution, when there is a scarcity of objects from the latter and a relative abundance from the former. Because of the extensive administration and bureaucracy that went into the operations of British colonialism, there are objects and archives that can be used to act as evidence for the incompleteness of abolition and the ongoing injustices of racial slavery. For example, the Act of Abolition of Slavery in 1833, which you can see on this slide here, legislated for the emancipation of enslaved people throughout the British Empire. However, it also details that the owners of enslaved people should be paid reasonable compensation for the loss of services forced from enslaved people. This compensation amounted to £20 million at that time, which is an extraordinary sum that is even difficult for us to calculate the actual total of today. But it was only in 2015, so 10 years ago, that British taxpayers finished paying off the debt which the British government incurred in order to compensate slave owners. So vast was this sum. There is also an extensive paper trail of compensation claims and receipts from the owners of enslaved people that provides an archive of complicity and profiting from enslavement. These claims can be found and searched on the UCL Legacies of British Slavery database on the internet. Anyone can go, look, type in names, and find out who was compensated. And you will see these entire map of compensation across the United Kingdom, which gives you a sense of the extent of complicity of British people in the system of enslavement. The main point I'm trying to make here is that there is extensive evidence that points to how reparations has been legislated for and paid. There is a precedent. The ongoing injustice is that they have been paid to enslavers and their descendants, not to enslaved people and their descendants. And because of this ongoing injustice, there are, of course, extensive and active campaigns within Britain and its former colonies to make amends. And with all campaigns against injustice, there are counter-arguments to protect the status quo. And these counter-arguments are often shaped by the ways in which Britain has misremembered its involvement in slavery, as I have spoken to. For example, that Britain wasn't as bad as other colonial powers, that more money was invested into abolishing slavery than what was made from it, that all this was in the past, and that we should move on. Which is why it's important that education systems in the UK, of which museums are a part, play a role in promoting an understanding of the realities of this history and its legacy, and also attempt in whatever way possible to collapse the distances between the various spheres in which slavery is enacted to make clear how Britain played a central, not peripheral role, and therefore perhaps ought to play a central role in addressing its ongoing injustices. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Michael Wood, trazendo aqui para nós essas informações e reflexões, né, sobre as questões relativas às injustiças históricas, né, e os direitos desrespeitados e a reparação discutida sob perspectivas que refletem a desigualdade com que os envolvidos foram tratados e as formas injustas em que foram efetivadas, né? E, finalmente, trazendo a importante sugestão, né, ideia força, né, que é que a educação patrimonial pode caminhar para formarmos pessoas, cidadãos, cidadãs mais conscientes de todas essas questões. Bem, mais uma vez agradecendo a essa mesa, né? E agora nós vamos iniciar a parte em que abriremos para perguntas e pequenas intervenções. Eu peço, desde logo, que as pessoas que forem pedir a palavra, que sejam, né, procurem ser objetivas nas suas indagações, para que a gente tenha tempo para mais gente perguntar. E, em segundo lugar, vou pedir também para todo mundo se identificar quando for fazer a sua pergunta ou comentário. Desde logo, também aviso a quem estiver assistindo de forma online que as suas questões vão poder aparecer aqui para nós na nossa tela de projeção. Bom, então, vou começar aqui já abrindo para esse debate, sem mais. Eu teria muitas coisas para falar, mas eu estou dando preferência mesmo para que quem está aí, né, ou online ou aqui, possa fazer a sua intervenção. Então, estão aqui os microfones disponíveis para quem quiser usar, já temos aí. Alguém já levantou o braço? Sérgio Suyama, muito obrigada.
Boa tarde. Sérgio Suyama, doutorando em História Comparada pela UFRJ. Gostaria de perguntar para a Chanaz, duas perguntas, uma para a Chanaz e uma para o Maio. Para a Chanaz, eu gostaria de perguntar como a questão racial ela é abordada no museu, porque também desculpe a ignorância, mas não sei se havia essa vínculo direto entre raça e escravidão, como havia aqui no Brasil, né? E eu queria então perguntar como que essa questão racial é abordada. Para o Marius, fiquei triste em saber que não poderei visitar o museu tão breve, né, tão logo, mas me interessa muito saber se a abordagem do museu, pelo fato de ele ser em Liverpool, como você disse, né, longe, né, dos destinos finais das pessoas escravizadas, se o público, né, o público do museu, que eu imagino talvez seja majoritariamente branco e europeu, influencia de alguma maneira na curadoria desse museu, né, no sentido de que talvez, como você disse, né, o foco do museu seja justamente mostrar o papel dos colonizadores, dos brancos colonizadores, nesse processo da escravidão. Ao passo que em museus como o Smithsonian, em Washington, e outros museus nas Américas, a tendência talvez seja mais de focar na diáspora, né? nos povos diaspóricos, nas culturas diaspóricas, afrodiaspóricas, etc. Se você, então, entende que o público diferenciado e o fato de estar na Inglaterra e não nas Américas, isso influencia a curadoria do museu.
Obrigada, Sérgio. 3 questões, vou juntar 3 questões e aí passo para me responder. Já temos aqui uma segunda pessoa inscrita, Beatriz. Manigônia.
Beatriz Manigoniana, da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta para vocês 3. Como vocês explicam para a gente, historiadores que não trabalham em museus, como é que foi a constituição do acervo de objetos, do acervo de cultura material, dos objetos que vocês relacionam à história da escravidão e do pós-abolição, nos diferentes acervos que vocês trabalham? Eu imagino que tenha havido um processo de mapeamento de acervo os acervos existentes para serem ressignificados, né, à luz da história que se quer contar agora, mas talvez também captação de novos acervos. Essa é a minha curiosidade.
Obrigada, Beatriz. Alguém mais? Batemos as 3 perguntas iniciais. Ou já podemos esquentar os tamborins com essas? Vamos? Bom, então, let's go.
Yeah, it was definitely racial chattel slavery at the Cape, the Indian Ocean. Like we do focus on that as well. I mean, we focus on, well, we should be able to focus on everything at the same time, in a sense. But definitely racial chattel slavery. I often tell people it was only black bodies that was being moved. It wasn't white bodies that was enslaved. It was black bodies that was moved to the Cape. African and Asian that was moved to the Cape, that was enslaved. Also, it's very important. We also really emphasize the fact that the racist laws and the apartheid laws was based on slavery. Slavery was the foundation for that. For example, I'm not sure if you're aware of the passbook that black South Africans had to carry during apartheid. That caused massive revolt in the country. We've got a passbook in the exhibition currently. So it is important for me to state that the very first form of a pass was a letter that had to be carried by the enslaved at the Cape. It was called a descentibrief in Dutch. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but they had to carry, each enslaved person had to carry a letter around with them when they were sent on errands or like to have to do jobs that actually listed who they belonged to, what they were wearing, what they looked like, etc. And if they were caught without it, they would be seen as runaway or absconding, and the punishment was severe. So, and also after a period of slavery, there was the Masters and Servants Act. There was like, that kept the black former enslaved person in its place. So definitely racist foundation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a really good question and a very, very important one as well. I'm going to try I could really talk about this for the next 2 hours, so you will have to stop me. But I think it's something that's really important for us to reflect on as a museum constantly, because there's different expectations as to what the International Slavery Museum should be. Because some people feel, for perfectly valid reasons, that it should be an international Black History Museum for Black people, about Black history and culture. And I understand where that desire comes from, but I am constantly reminding people that that is not this museum. That this is a museum dedicated to racial slavery, and with that has a different responsibility. And as you alluded to, our audience is potentially very different to audiences that might exist here or in other places around the world, where over 80% of our visitors are white people. And no matter what we do throughout this redevelopment project, I don't think that's going to dramatically change. And so what experience do we want our audiences to have when they come to the museum when it reopens? I think it is very important that the descendants of enslaved people are able to see the history of their ancestors reflected and to feel empowered by the history and the way that they engage with that. But we can't then just ignore the 80% of white visitors that also come to the space and what impact we're actually hoping to have on them as well. And for me, I think it's something that we have to think very, very carefully about, and I think about and reflect on a lot, because for me it's also deeply personal, in that I would be identified, be racialized in the British context as mixed race. And with that, my maternal ancestors are descent from enslaved people in Jamaica. They worked on sugar plantations in Jamaica for generations. And my paternal ancestors worked on the docks in Liverpool and would have been racialized as white. I actually got in the records, one of my ancestors, his profession was listed as a cotton picker. And this was not an enslaved person, this was someone who offloaded cargoes of cotton in the docks of Liverpool. And so his employment and his family's livelihood were highly dependent on this system of transatlantic slavery. Whether he liked it or not, I don't know what his consciousness was, what his moral compass was, but he was connected to the system in some doubt. Do I feel guilt about this? I can't say that I do. But I acknowledge it. It's part of my history as well, as much as my maternal ancestry is part of my history and who I am. And so when I think about what I want white people to experience when they come to the museum, I want them to feel connected to this history. I can't control whether they feel guilt or whether they feel anger or hurt. What I hope is that they feel connected. I don't want them to come to a museum and think that they're learning about the history of Black people, and oh, wasn't that sad that that happened to them, that I have nothing to do with this, that I'm not connected to this in any way. I want everyone who comes to the museum to understand that this is part of your history, that this history has shaped the very world that we live in, the economic systems that we are part of, that we have inherited, the very ground that we walk on when we're walking around the Kenya Africa or walking around the Liverpool docks is shaped by this history. So now you have this connection, what can we collectively do about it? So that kind of aspiration to see people, to make people feel connected to this history and feel that sense of collective responsibility definitely shapes how we're approaching the curation of the museum.
Thank you, obrigada. Eu vou passar para a Aline e depois para vocês dois responderem a questão da Beatriz.
Eu vou responder a questão da Beatriz, agradecendo pela pergunta e também pedindo para ela controlar, porque é uma pergunta que gera uma outra conversa, mas eu vou tentar ser bem objetiva e vou retomar um pouco a fala do Cícero aqui na abertura, né, quando ele falou do exemplo do Museu Histórico Nacional, que foi construído foi criado para escrever uma história da nação, e que história era essa, e o que a gente tem feito hoje com essa história. E, partindo disso, eu vou escolher dois objetos que estão à disposição, para além da escravidão, para exemplificar, né, como é que a gente age para falar com visitantes, né, sobre a presença desses objetos nas coleções do museu. No caso do ABB, que eu mostrei aqui, do ABB de Oxum, ele foi adquirido muito naquele sentido colecionista do folclore, né, que acreditava que essa manifestação ia desaparecer, né, a religião afrodiaspórica, e era preciso ter algo, né, daquilo que deixaria de existir. E ele integrou a coleção do museu, mas ele não integrava a narrativa histórica do museu, né? Ele ficou durante muito tempo em reserva técnica. E hoje ele é visto como um documento dessa agência afrodiaspórica, como não só como um documento da história dessas religiões de matriz africana, mas também como um documento de resistência desses agentes que mantiveram, né, essa prática. A gente poderia até colocar um ABB, esse que eu apresentei aqui, do século XIX, do século XX, e o caso dos instrumentos de tortura, que esses sim estavam na narrativa representando a escravidão e não a branquitude que usava eles contra esses corpos. Então, isso fala um pouco sobre como esses objetos entraram no museu e o que a gente tem feito hoje deles. E a exposição é um bom exercício de mostrar as outras histórias, as outras narrativas que nós podemos compor com esses objetos.
It's a good question. I think that when the museum opened in 2007, it was quite a didactic experience. Like, this is the history, and it wasn't necessarily presenting or being transparent about the processes as to how this collection has developed and all the complexities around that. And in some ways, it's hard when at the end you're reduced to like 30-word labels to explain a certain object. But it's something that we reflected on quite a lot as a curatorial team at the moment. Like one of the early slides that I showed you was a gallery in the museum called Life in West Africa. And this gallery came about through a desire to present Africa before slavery. But when you're opening a new museum, often you don't have a collection. So the International Slave Museum drew on the broader collections of National Museums Liverpool, including the World Museum, which is a typical colonial ethnographic museum collection that acquired its collections under British colonial control of African countries after slavery, not before. But the gallery doesn't really present that level of complexity to the history, even though it is part of it. Its colonial legacy is also connected to racial slavery, as we've heard today. So as a museum at the moment, we're trying to explore ways that we can lean into complexity. This is one of the curatorial principles that we have, and to present transparently some of the complexities as to how the collection that we're displaying has come to be and what that might mean for some of the ethics around display, some of the questions of the future of some of these objects in the museum as well.
Thank you, Myers. Now you go back to yeah, so I, in terms of collections, part of the slide is actually to also talk about how we've used the collections. We've used a few objects from, we now call it like an enslavement collection. When I started at Tizico, I was told that there wasn't much slavery collections in our collection, but that wasn't true. Per se, we then had to just do the work and go through it ourselves, and then we found objects directly linked to enslaved people. So what we've got and the way we've interpreted in the space, we've sort of built like permanent cases now as part of an installation to keep it up permanently or for as long as possible. So we've got a brass bangle, for example, that belonged to an enslaved woman. Right? All part of the William Peer collection, which was actually given by a white sort of patron. And so we got the bangle and we use that as almost like a representation for the enslaved woman. So the brass bangle, we've got, for example, a 17th century fire bucket, we call it a fire bucket, it's actually made with leather. And the way we contextualize it, so contextualizing is very important for us when we're interpreting it for our purposes. There was arson, there was lots of fires at the Cape, and arson was a form of resistance done by enslaved people. And the fire bucket, the bucket was used to put out fires. So that's the kind of connections we make. We even have a pipe that we know was made by an enslaved person. Provenance is not really detailed. So we got the name of the person, but we don't have much more information. But so we try to, again, the interpretation and reading deeper and connecting the archiving ways, creative ways, just so that we can display this collection. And yeah, and so not all of it is on display, but we're using quite a bit of it. Claro, a Lili vai complementar duas coisinhas.
Não, a primeira é que eu gostaria de dar o nome, né, do Tony Glyton, que é o autor da fotografia que eu passei aqui, eu tinha esquecido. E a segunda coisa, complementando a resposta, é a importância, né, ouvindo a chamada também, do trabalho coletivo, né, do trabalho de curadoria compartilhada com os detentores. No caso da coleção de objetos de religiões de matriz africana do Museu Histórico Nacional, a gente contou com o Pateiro, que esteve ontem com a gente, mas vale mencionar também a importância da curadoria compartilhada dos povos de terreiro aqui do Rio de Janeiro com a coleção Nosso Sagrado do Museu da República, né? O Eduardo Costônio veio aqui de manhã e ele participou de todo esse processo, foi pesquisador, então eu não queria deixar de enfatizar que, como a Fernanda falou, né, sozinhos nós não vamos a lugar nenhum. E essa troca, né, de saberes, esse trabalho coletivo é fundamental para proporcionar essas outras leituras e olhares para esses objetos.
Alguma questão a mais aí da audiência? Bom, eu vou fazer então uma questão aqui, aproveitar agora que deixa para todo mundo, né? Agora já posso fazer. Enfim, peço aí para cada um dos integrantes dessa mesa que, ao comentar ou responder essa questão, também possam fazer suas palavras, né, finais aqui. Enfim, que volta ao tema que os três colocaram, mas que ainda assim eu acho que vale a pena reiterar. É pensar que em museus que vão tratar, que vão expor objetos da escravidão, vão lidar com uma história muito sensível e com um tema que muitas vezes é sentido e pressentido como uma forma, ou seja, expor esses objetos como uma forma de reiterar o sofrimento. Né? Então, de que maneira a gente pode pensar caminhos para que a exposição desses objetos, né, que refletem uma história tão dura, tantas dores, não venham a reiterar esse sofrimento, que é o que muitas vezes causa até uma rejeição a essa temática em espaços museais. Então, eu vou começar pelo último a falar. Vou começar pelo Maio, seguindo ao contrário a colher que roda esse caldeirão. Não é o do Hulk, não é o caldeirão. Essa nossa sopa de possibilidades.
Wow, it's another big question. I mean, I don't think it would come to anyone's surprise that as a museum, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we curate violence, because ultimately this history and the legacies that we live with are violence. And it's inescapable. I feel as a curator, when I'm working with the material culture, I can't avoid the violence. To some extent, I'm exposed to it so much every day that I've become somewhat desensitized to it. And that's not good. It's not proud of that at all, but it's not actually possible to fully feel this history every day and to work with it and stay sane. It's not. You have to desensitize. You have to emotionally regulate. But I think about what is the purpose of this violence in terms of what we're trying to allow visitors to understand and what impact we're trying to have. And in Liverpool, at least, I can't speak for everywhere around the world and what's needed. But as I mentioned, Liverpool is very detached from the very real violence of its history. And I was doing a tour of the Bolonga Walk, going to the ENI as well, and seeing the archaeological material, but also the human remains that have been left behind by this history. And what's interesting is you go to Liverpool, and all the archaeological record throws up much of the very similar materials, so many tobacco pipes, so many clay sugarcane molds, so many glass bottle fragments, with no dead bodies. The absence of violence is incredibly violent in the United Kingdom. And people need to understand that this is a violent history with very violent legacies that have been left behind. And if that means people need to see it, then people need to see it. And sometimes actually seeing an object has much more of an impact than me telling you about it. Because you can't deny the very real manifestation of shackles or of a whip. You can not look if you don't want to, but it's there. It's there in front of you. I could tell you about brutality on plantations, but someone could say, oh, we were making it up, and so on. And I think that the other thing that we are grappling with right now in the present is a very dangerous political movement who would rather not confront this history for their own political motives. And so I think we have to be conscious of that when we're deciding whether or not to display certain things because of the sensitivities around it.
So there was one installation artwork, it's an installation art piece that we picked from the first tranche of slavery exhibition at the Slave Lodge. And the work was done by Roderick Sauls. And Rod Sauls was part of the unfinished conversation. He speaks about what freedom means. But anyway, Rod Sauls is a classically trained artist and who did a lot of research into his own slave ancestry. And he also suffered forced removals. He was removed from District 6. So he has that painful personal history as well. And so Rod did this installation in the early 2000s, and it's called Almal moet weet van ons verdriet. And that's Afrikaans, and I'll translate it for you. Everyone must know our sorrow. Everyone must know our sorrow. And it's made like it's like a massive wall panel. It's made of a crete stone, right? And what he did on the stone, he's also like he does the litho printing, and he did a plan, the original plan of the slave lodge, takes up the entire square of this panel. So he's confronting the visitor with the slave lodge and the history of the slave lodge in its physical form, but in the form of a plan. And then in this panel, it's got hollowed out boxes with lights in it. And in the box, he's got objects. So he's got showing the truth of slavery, which we talk about in the back passage, and it's important. We do tell the history of slavery, the violence, because that's the truth. We can't get away from it. And yes, we talk about humanizing and moving forward as people from history of slavery to a people's history. It's very important to show how we evolved. It's very important, but we can't gloss over what happened to us, and it's important. So we talk in the back passage, we talk about how women suffered and that enslaved women suffered. But anyway, so in rods, in these boxes, it's hollowed out and lit up. There's shackles, there's bones, but it's not human bones, but it's meant to be, you're not meant to know. So you can infer, it's actually like animal bones that they dug up in the courtyard, from waste, where the enslaved cooked maybe food in the courtyard of the slave lodge. So when they did an archaeological dig, they dug that up. So he's got all those things in these boxes. But what makes it really interesting, so he wants people to know about our sorrow, he wants people to know how we were abused and hurt and the pain and suffering that was caused. But also in the boxes, he's got products. So cloth, knitted things, items, basketry, weaving, vats that the wine was made to keep wine, to hold the wine, all those kinds of things that the enslaved made, that the enslaved was forced to produce. And he said that came from him reflecting on the severe labor demands on them. But he was saying it was also a way for him to think back and connect about the creativity, what they were able to make. We also had clothes in these boxes, and he was saying they made clothes, that was a creative thing. And he said they also made him think about his creativity. Where did it come from? It didn't come from his mother and his father. And so he keeps on looking back and he keeps on trying to make this connection to his slave ancestry. So he wants people to know about what was done to us and about the sorrow, but he also wants us to know that our people also had agency, our people were able to make things. And from there, local industries grew. Tailors, enslaved people were phenomenal tailors in the Boer camp, full of tailors, washerwomen, people, carpenters, that type of thing. So that is how we were able to survive and make it as after emancipation. So and then also it's just important to note that when he created this work, he said he actually wanted it to be completely dark, the room, because he was saying his thoughts were around what a woman, an enslaved woman, must have felt like when she was brought into the slave lodge. He wanted it to be experiential. He wanted to visit it to understand this severe violence and fear. And so he said he wanted the place to be dark, and he wanted people to get that feeling of walking into a dark space, because when it was a slave lodge, it was so dark inside and dirty that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So that was the idea behind it. And then he wanted the light box to be like hope, symbolize hope. So of course we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that at the time. There's health and safety and public safety. But that was the idea. So with his work and his interpretive work, it's always about wanting people to understand what was suffered, but also to understand that our people had agency, and our people were the makers of the history, in a sense, of this.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigada. Aline.
Bom, eu vou tentar ser bem rápida, porque também, né, Mônica. Mas eu concordo com o Marius, né, é um assunto importante e não abordá-lo pode ser uma violência maior. Mas, como a Xanais, eu vou dar 2 exemplos de como pode ser abordado, né? Pode não ser o melhor caminho, mas é um caminho possível. E eu vou falar justamente dos instrumentos de tortura, né? Eu acho que não dá para expor objetos de tortura de forma, né, que não seja contextualizada, que não seja de forma crítica. E aí eu vou apontar para uma possibilidade de exposição que esvazia a romantização que se tem em relação a esse passado, né? Como se esse passado, os instrumentos de tortura, como sofriam, que bom que não existe mais isso no mundo de hoje, né? E o que a gente, e aí eu cito o que a gente fez na exposição Brasil Decolonial, Outras Histórias, no Museu Histórico Nacional, eu, Keila, Marcia Chuva, Leila, Fernanda Castro e Brenda Coelho, que foi contrapor esses instrumentos de tortura com a realidade de violência do mundo contemporâneo, que mostra que aqueles instrumentos podem não ser mais usados, embora alguns ainda sejam, mas a prática dessa violência, e que tem corpos específicos que sofrem com essa violência, ela ainda é presente, é isso que precisa combater. Então, isso é essa abordagem crítica. E uma outra abordagem é a abordagem esperançosa, que eu acho que a arte contemporânea do Yuri Cruz nos mostra, né? Pegar uma imagem, né, que é do Jacques Arago, uma imagem histórica e que se chama punição, né? E transformá-la, e transformar essa personagem representada pelos castigos físicos impostos pela presença de instrumentos de tortura no seu corpo em uma imagem de uma pessoa livre, de uma pessoa empoderada e de uma pessoa que tem de volta a sua dignidade, a sua boca e a sua voz. Então, é uma forma de falar o que nós queremos, né? Nós não queremos a permanência dessa violência, mas nós queremos a liberdade.
Bom, gente, agradecendo muito aqui a participação de todas e todos aqui nessa mesa. Sem dúvida, enfim, quem acompanha meus trabalhos, minhas reflexões, sabe como essa questão é importante e continua, né, pautando os trabalhos que eu procuro desenvolver, mesmo aqui no Arquivo Nacional. Agradeço a todo mundo que esteve presente aqui, seja online, seja dessa forma presencial física. Excelente mesa, acho que vamos ter muito assunto aqui para o nosso intervalo, né? Temos 15 minutos de intervalo. Marilena.
Temos a mediação da Mônica Lima e aos participantes por compartilhar experiências internacionais sobre memória, museu e reparação. Seguiremos com a próxima mesa às 16h15.